Today we have a special guest. His name is Kadamba Kanana Swami, also known as KK Swami. He's originally from Holland, and in teens, in fact in his 17, he left his country and he went to India in search for something which is higher in terms of a spiritual quest. So that was not the first time that he visited afterwards as well. Then he lived in India, in Vrindavan, for many years, and he was practicing Bhakti Yoga. Then later he started teaching Bhakti Yoga, traveling the world. He gives seminars in many institutions, many universities, and other corporate institutions. This time he is also a very well-versed musician. So we are very fortunate to get his association, so we welcome him.
Thank you very much for hosting us, really. I'm the guest, yes, a world traveler who is here with you just during my short stay in Melbourne. A topic for the day, stress-related topic. There's plenty of it, stress in the world of today, but in general, I guess even in history, stress is such a thing. It's not that village life is free from stress, because the entire world is basically, it's one of the ingredients of life. So I saw something on the poster, stop worrying. Okay, but it looks to me that there's also something like healthy worrying. You can't just write off worrying altogether. No worries, easier said than done. Reality is also that there are things in life we must stress about. So first of all, I thought there is healthy stress. So I'll see how I can relate to the topic as a whole and where we come. It's not a prepared lecture in itself, but I'm prepared because I give lots of lectures, one after the other. But before the lecture begins, they've asked me to sing, lead the musical mantra meditation, which we do for about 10 minutes or so. And then after that, we'll begin with the talk. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Krishna Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Krishna, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Recently we had a gathering in Germany and we did 1 week of 12 hours just chanting with about 1,000 people. Of course, everyone was chanting, so 1,000 people chanting creates like quite some energy in a sports hall, and we had like a camping ground around it. And for 1 week people came from all over the world, Australia, America, all over Europe. And it became something where people were just lifted to just beyond their normal, the things that normally occupy their mind just seemed far away. So, of course, in a short demonstration like this, we cannot get the full taste, but you can imagine what it would have been like. I behaved just now musically. I don't use the thing. I behaved, actually. I'm an old rocker from the 70s. So sometimes I break these harmoniums. But as you can see, the owner that's him, he put skeleton and bones on there, so I'm sort of a little careful with this one, so I didn't rock it. Anyway, back to our topic of no stress. Stress, first of all, as I said before, the world is designed for stress. It's built in. Babies don't come singing out of the womb, you know what I mean? When you come into this world, you don't sing from, it's a happy day. I have never met such a baby. Usually they make other noise, and it means they're stressed, obviously, and it takes time. We have to calm them down, and on the flight over from Africa I came, there was this baby. It happens sometimes. Stress. So stress is starting early in life, all throughout life, but our perception of reality changes quite a bit, and with time. And as our perception changes, we also experience situations quite different. And therefore, one key to our experience of reality is consciousness. Consciousness is obviously a biased element within the equation. What one person is thinking is great. Like, okay, when I hit 13 years old and I had my first electric guitar, it was on a good volume, and you know, the whole street was like enjoying, but maybe not as much as me. I was possibly the one who was enjoying it the most. The point was that what was for me ecstasy was maybe for others, oh no, here he goes again, because I was doing it every day, so they must have really loved it. You can just imagine. Anyway, eventually I got good at it, relatively. So, whatever may be. So the old principle of what is enjoyment for another is a cause of stress for another. And that is consciousness. Therefore, consciousness is a key in the perception of reality. One time I was the driver of a Mercedes van with 9 passengers through the Himalayas on the way to Badrinath. Badrinath, it's a long drive. It's about 475 kilometers into the Himalayas. So that's serious driving. And it goes over those kind of really high roads, narrow, with crumbly edges, no rail. Yeah? And then you're driving in a van. And I still remember, I was on the wheel and, you know, looking, and I saw also buses lying down there, the ones that sort of went over the edge. And then people in the van were seeing the white snow-capped mountains and going, oh, what an amazing view. And I was going, yeah, what an amazing view. So it's all, the perception is very much part of reality. And nowadays in quantum mechanics, the observer is becoming part of the equation. And nowadays it is found that the observer has actually an effect on the reality that he's perceiving. All right. Very good. So we are indeed just living beings, each with our consciousness. So we cannot remove the stress because stress is basically built in the design. There is happiness and distress in the world. Their performance is a requirement. Maybe in a modern environment with serious educational institutions, exams and such kind of things are there, and then a production consumption society and so on, with the fast pace of life that is connected to it. In the year 2000, 1/3 of the world population lived in cities. Now, in 2011, it's over 51%. So it's a tremendous increase in the last 10 years of a huge draw towards the cities. And, as they say, the pace of life is increasing and increasing. People even talk faster in the cities than in the countryside, where life is more peaceful. Well, these things are certainly a fact, but anxiety remains, also in a slow world, because after all there are fundamental fears in life, fears of death, fears of this, fears of birth. It begins at birth, then, disease, old age, death. These are elements that cause anxiety, because it strikes in everyone's life, and we hope it's just going to miss us, whatever. And so that cannot just be removed, but the consciousness can change. The consciousness changes, of course, in the history. For example, if in the Middle Ages, in European Middle Ages, if someone would be struck by disease, then it was the work of the devil, clearly, and possibly some witchcraft. So then they would weigh people, and it's like, I am from a town in Europe, in the Netherlands, and we actually have there the original scales still that they used for the witches. They're still there, tourists are coming, and it's like impressive little things where witches were weighed to see if they were too light. Nowadays we're worried about too heavy. Those days worried about being too light. Just see how the times change. So nowadays it appears completely primitive, that kind of concept, but it was a reality. People were completely convinced this is what is going on. Now we have a different perception. So with time, perception changes again and again. People believed the earth was flat. Now we laugh at that, except when you're driving, like when I'm driving out at Broken Hill, right, then I'm not so sure that the world is not flat. And I have a feeling that Broken Hill is just on the edge somewhere, and that if you don't go too far out in the outback, because there you go over the edge, straight down. So like this, it's sort of a lot of it is happening in the mind. You can see with my examples that a lot of our anxiety is simply happening in the mind. It's not happening in real life. It also comes from being very attached to the result. If in this world I'm very attached to the result of my activities, I really want a certain thing, then when it's not working, maximum stress. Another way is go with the flow, right? Accept it, accept fate, try to get a handle on things, but more acceptance in life. They say that people who have a flexible thumb, that can bend backward, that they do better than people with a stiff thumb. Because you can test your thumb now. Sort of inconspicuously behind the chair, see if it bends well. Because they say that flexibility in the body like that is also reflecting in the mind. And that a person who is more flexible, who can more adjust to situation, does a lot better than someone who has very fixed, preconceived ideas. So in this way, we're seeing that there are certain type of mentalities that can help us get a better grip on situations that we cannot bring under control. This is the biggest problem. Things are out of control. Anything can happen anytime. Murphy's Law, whatever can go wrong, will go wrong, right? Or was it shall go wrong? I forgot. Will or shall. But, alright, so these things are there, that things are not under control. So, a lot of people are aware of these things, I think, for example, in psychology. This topic has been addressed many times, and also the theme that one should be accepting, one should come to acceptance, one shouldn't place so much force upon himself, but one should rather come to acceptance in life. This theme is not new. Psychology also, psychology has dealt for a long time with oppression and accepting elements within ourselves and so on, and in our environment. And then in more recent history, psychology took a turn and went towards positive psychology. Positive psychology is about putting positive values in one's life. This is of some interest to us. For example, of course, one can say, well, it is a very individual issue, to decide what is positive and what is not positive. All right, but there are some values that obviously can simplify life. For example, honesty. We can, of course, give a long moral lecture about why honesty and so on, but leaving all morality aside, just from a pure practical angle, honesty makes life simple. If you tell lots of lies, then it's very complicated, because you have to remember who you told which lie, and you have to make sure that they don't meet each other. For example, right? And if suddenly they do, then you have to do something emergency, like drop over a flower vase, or create some other disaster to distract the attention, so that that disastrous conversation of verifying the facts cannot take place, isn't it? Something like that. So the more lies we spin, the more complexity we create. So honesty is then considered in positive psychology a positive value, and is as such being introduced and propagated. And okay, very well. Well, that is of some interest to me, because I, of course, you heard the introduction, and coming in from somehow or other an Indian angle a Vedic angle. Although I don't look Indian, I've been there for a considerable amount of my life. Well, almost half, so I'm half Indian. Yes, as you can see, there's an Indian half and Western half. So, well, then, yes, Indian culture was of interest to me because Indian culture offered a more spiritual approach to life. Indian, famous for yoga, meditation, and so on, which has now become a household item. But in 1970, yoga and meditation was for the in crowd. The world in the West had nothing to do with it, but the in crowd, the in crowd was doing such things. So that sounded interesting to me. So I went there to check it out, to India, and well, I found an overwhelming culture, and I sat down at the side of the road and just watched. I was in the city of Benares and I saw a lot of people passing by. There were practically no cars, maybe one car an hour, mostly bicycles, a deafening sound of ringing bicycle bells, right? At the same time, there were cows walking in the streets. They were sacred and they were completely peaceful, as if they didn't hear all those bells. Yeah? And then an ox cart came by, which just came straight out of the Middle Ages, from some of these medieval paintings. It just drove right through the street, right there and then. And yes, I was somewhere in a world which was living in a completely different dimension of time and so on. And life was much more natural than in the Western world. People were packing their foodstuffs in leaves, right? Not in plastic, but in leaves. I thought it was ecologically quite interesting, right? Although ecology was not such a big issue as it's now, still, it was interesting. There was a clay cup for drinking, and you could just afterwards just throw it away and feel good about it. You know what I mean? Different, instead of like plastic throwing. If you dare on a highway throw a plastic bag, just with some leftover garbage from the snacks out of the window of your car nowadays, right? In 2011, behind you, people almost go off the road honking the horn and making a big drama about it, because what is the biggest sin nowadays? To sin against the sacred environment. This is the holiest thing that exists in the world now. The environment. Oh God, the global warming, is it really happening? I'm not sure. I'm not convinced, actually, that there is climate shifting. Yes, climate changing, but is it really getting warmer? I'm still freezing in Melbourne. Nothing's changed. This morning I wasn't convinced that it was global warming. God, it's October. It should be a bit warmer, isn't it? I got my winter socks back out. Yes, so we're living in a world of propaganda. Anyway, I was for a moment at positive psychology. I came in with the Vedic culture. I wanted to make a bit of a connection there. The Vedic culture is recognizing that material nature manifests itself in what is called three gunas, or three qualities. three qualities. It's in Sanskrit, sattva, rajas, tamas, which you could translate as goodness, passion, and ignorance. So, of course the translation is not exactly right, but goodness. There is goodness in this world. Yeah? There are places in goodness. Let's say the little pond with the lotus flowers and the swan peacefully swimming, right? In goodness. So yeah, then you have a situation in passion, downtown, you know, shopping, looking, going, move, right? Stand clear of the door. Downtown. Okay, passion, right? And then ignorance, some places where just guys are sitting there all day long, you know, loading it up this way, that way, or whatever way they can, and in between pull the handle of the fruit machines or something, you know, to see if they can pay for the drinks of the day. Or sitting there shooting space invaders or God knows what. The whole day. Ignorance. So like that we see different levels of consciousness. Someone sits behind a computer, plays a computer game for I forgot how many, but over 30 hours and dies. Did you hear that one? Yeah, that was in the papers. It was really interesting. After 30 something hours of playing a computer game non-stop, he died. That's kind of interesting. Just colorful detail. Well, so we are seeing these three qualities in nature: goodness, passion, and ignorance. A peaceful situation, or food in passion and ignorance, food that sustains, that brings health, and in goodness, food that tastes great but kills you, passion, right? Food that is stale, rotten, and outright unhealthy, right? You know, living on where the packing has more nutrition than the food itself. That kind of food is in the mode of ignorance. Okay, and the result is there, obviously. So, you know, you are what you eat, so has been said by the wise of yonder. There is truth in it, obviously. And not only what you eat, you become what you take in. You know? I mean, if you sit the whole day in front of a TV, eating some chips and God knows what else, pigskin chips or something for variety, what do you think will happen to the consciousness? Little by little, one becomes totally dull. Well, we have plenty of such examples. So, positive psychology has come upon something which is in line with Vedic culture. Namely, that one should put positive values of goodness in place in one's life. I gave an example of honesty, and I could go over a whole list, but it would take too much time in one lecture, so I leave it as it is, because everyone can more or less figure it out. But to put such positive values in place, it says that will diminish the anxiety. That will diminish anxiety a lot. So that is called living in the mode of goodness, and the whole thing is that by associating with goodness in one's environment, the inner consciousness also develops in goodness, because there is not necessarily a correlation between the two. For example, we can be in a place which is in goodness, go back to our pond with the swan, but if we're in passion, then we think, let's see if the thing can fly. Take a stone, throw it and see if it can go. Hey, you know, yeah, great, man. Wow, swan's taken off. That's where the external mode and the internal mode are different. Yeah. It can also go the other way around. When we are living in a passionate city in the world, we can be internally in goodness. So if one creates for himself a sacred space at home, where one becomes rejuvenated, a place in goodness, that is the place where you get all your positive energy from the mode of goodness. You live there in goodness. Living in goodness means you eat in goodness, you sleep in goodness, you just, not just any time, one day you're up till 4, next day at 10, next day, it's like all irregular. No, some regulation, some rhythm, so that positive energy builds up from our own private situation. Then that mode of goodness will give us the strength and a certain immunity towards these lower influences around us. Then we don't become so affected. So that is the beginning of uplifting one's consciousness to goodness. Of course, Vedic culture takes it a step further. Saying coming to goodness is helpful for people because then you don't become so entangled. A lot of people use yoga, meditation for that, actually. That's what they use it for. They do some meditation to come more to goodness, to be more calm, to be more peaceful, all qualities of goodness. Yoga also fit, but then also for the mind, to get more control over the mind. Yes, all goodness. That's not the all in all. There is something else where you say like, well, there is the spiritual, the pure spiritual perspective in the Vedic concept, which is basically that when man and woman unite in sexual activity for the sake of, to have a child, let's say, if these, when the male and female secretions mix and create the right chemical combination, it is said, then life can be conceived at that point. And that looks like a pure biological process. However, according to the Vedic literature, that's not all there's to it. There's more to it. It is said, according to Vedic literature, that when the biological conditions are being created, that exactly at that point, a subtle entity, a subtle living being, enters into that physical equation, yes, as a third factor. So there were male and female secretions uniting, creating a favorable condition, and then a living being enters into that combination. That's the Vedic concept. The living being then being a soul, right? A spiritual spark of life. That spiritual spark of life then enters into that mix, which gradually develops and so on, pregnancy and After 7 months, it's said the living being comes to full consciousness, and for 2 months is conscious within the womb, and then comes out. We know about babies kicking and so on, right? So that's there. Now, the Vedas, they say that whatever the consciousness of the parents is at the time of conception, that will determine the type of child they will attract. And so that's interesting also. So the consciousness of the parents have a direct influence on what kind of soul will make an entrance. It's like if one, for example, if it is on Saturday night in the back of the car, that's not considered the highest environment and the highest approach to the matter. And if it's like with, let's say, with each half a bottle of certain drinks sort of spinning around in the head, that's usually what happens then. It says, in such a case, if one is in an intoxicated state of mind, that means in a tamasic state of mind or influenced by the mode of ignorance due to the intoxication, then one might attract a living being who in his last life who was roaming around in the ghostly species. So there's your little sweetheart, baby, baby, baby. Interesting, isn't it? So, yeah, there is a whole science there. And Vedic literature is very detailed in many aspects. And quite interesting is that there are many of these details that are corresponding with modern science. For example, I recently read in a newspaper that biologists have calculated, not yet found, but calculated that there are 8,700,000 species of life. There ought to be. Yeah? Vedic literature says 8,400,000 species. It's very close, right? Or 300,000 species, okay, you know, give or take, right? A little. And that was a calculation, they didn't even find them yet, so shockingly close, actually. Maybe some plagiarism, who knows, to be investigated. Yes, and for example, we see in the Vedas, we see a reference to the origin of the universe at 4.3 billion years, versus a general figure for the Big Bang at 10 billion years. That's still in the billions. If you look at Bishop Ussher, who came up in 16-something with a biblical figure based on calculations of the Old Testament, and he did it quite in a scientific way, and Ussher's views stood till almost 1800, right? So stood for like about 150 years, and the idea was 5000 BC, that the origin of the universe, 5000 BC. I mean, nowadays you just go like, that's backward. That's really out of touch with reality as we know it now, based on scientific information, based on geology, based on such information. So then we see a Vedic culture which has many, in ancient times, many corresponding concepts, distances of planets, very much corresponding with modern measurements and so on. So just to give you an idea. Anyway, so that puts Vedic culture as it indicates that we're dealing with a substantial source of information, not necessarily, let us not necessarily assume that it is the truth, right? Not in this institution. For that, we can be in another institution. But here we will say, at least, it is a substantial body of information. So, interesting. So it says at the time when life is then coming about through man and wife uniting, or man and woman uniting, then a child appears, a soul enters. So in this, where is the soul when it is not in the embodied state? That could be a question. When the soul is not in the embodied state, there are several possibilities. One, it is floating for a while in a subtle body. if it stays there, then we are really dealing with the ghost existence. It stays there for a longer period of time. It is said, Vedic literature says there's life on other planets. Vedic literature says there is not only one universe, there are more universes. There is life in other universes. So many concepts are given. It says, but besides the description of the material realm, it describes a anti-material world. It describes a spiritual realm, a realm where then the living being is existing in a reality which is free from anxiety. Welcome. Came the right. Free from anxiety. So according to that domain, there is a world where one can exist eternally without stress. Well, believe it or not, hallelujah, it sounds a bit like the heavens. It sounds like the heavens of all the sacred, in parentheses, scriptures of the world. Oxford has a site, sacredtext.com. One can there see an interesting collection of the world's scriptures, and if one reads a bit in them, more or less they all have the same concept. The Germanic tribes had the Valhalla with beer forever. The sort of a continuation of the German beer fest. Then the next level was the we have Islam, where you can have 17 maidens, or we have another tradition where you get wings and a harp, or something like that, either a musical wing or a trumpet, or anyway, we see different ideas of an eternal realm. So Vedic literature comes up with the same concept. For modern man, that looks something like really too airy-fairy, too difficult to prove, really something, we have no handle on such things, from our modern perception where we want to measure everything. Because we have that kind of an approach, it's called an ascending approach. The ascending approach is an approach where we try to empirically establish knowledge, and by fact-finding, and as we are verifying facts, we are gradually increasing our understanding. Of course, once there was a time that science was finding out the truth, then we got a new concept of shifting paradigms, and now we're living in a scientific model of always shifting paradigms that are true within itself, but not necessarily capturing the one truth. Fine, whatever may be. In the ascending process, we're slowly increasing our body of knowledge. We are here in a university, and we have records. Right? We have records of like all scientific findings of previous generations of scientists, right? And that's all that information is stored, and in this way we're building on that. And you one day can write it, your doctoral thesis as well, and it will add, to the glories of science, which will gradually expand. Of course, how long it will last, I don't know. Maybe until, there's big troubles now with electronic data, because the programs are constantly updated, and no one can update all the data from all the old formats to the new formats, and therefore huge quantities of data are getting lost in this digital era every day. Oh my God, knowledge is getting lost. again, a shifting paradigm, a drifting continent of knowledge. All right, so much for that. Vedic culture offers us techniques in terms of coming to goodness, which give us a handle on dealing with stress and anxiety. Vedic culture gives us another concept, a concept of an eternal world where one is actually an eternal entity, deathless and so on. And when one realizes that, then one can become oblivious to material anxiety. That is found in self-realized personalities who are then completely peaceful, and nothing in this world can stress them out because they are living in the eternal world internally. So they are detached. So detachment is also helpful. If the more attached we are, the more anxiety we have. The more you have, the more anxiety. So simple living and high thinking is an approach which can, high thinking in terms of either positive values, of goodness, or higher still, being self-realized. Simple living and high thinking can actually bring us to a point of inner peacefulness. From that platform, everything becomes much easier. Exams are, for example, such things that a lot of people go into a total state of extreme anxiety, and somehow or other go through this ordeal, write the paper, and then see what happens. Right? Some need pills, some need do breathing exercises before, or other things. But if we would be able to be completely relaxed, then probably we'd do a lot better, as always in life. So the mode of goodness can help us, or even more so, to be self-realized is the best. This lecture is meant to give a Vedic angle on the topic of stress and on the world in general, since it's built in the world's design. And I am, in general terms, giving an overview and a structure of how the mechanics of how Vedic culture can tackle such an issue as anxiety. If one wants to know more, then one would have to go in more detail, which I leave it as it is. My introduction's over. I'm now sort of giving you a few seconds to crank up the necessary brain cells and whatever into an active mode. I'd like to invite some feedback if you'd like, and we can try and discuss. See if we get something interesting. Water. Yeah, it's I think that the Western world is a very experimental society. Yeah? It's not a society which is it's not a society which is very, which is operating according to a preconceived script of how to create a peaceful world. I'll give an example. We drive cars, and then after a while we think, my God, we're fumigating ourselves. What are we going to do about it? Huh? As an example, we deal with insects, right? And then we spray them, and so on. I just read this horror story about water in Delhi and containing all these antibiotic-resistant strains of bacteria, all kinds of that. And so, what can be said? It's an experimental world. Right? And in that article about the anti-resistant strain of bacteria, they were basically saying that, experts in the field were predicting that we're going to get a post-antibiotic era where the wonder cure of antibiotics will no longer be available. So, well, that's intense, because I was in India, and at one point, I don't know if you remember that, but at one point, the Black Plague, the one from the Middle Ages, that killed 1/3 of the world population, it was back. And I was in India, and at one point, they closed all the airports, right? And no more planes were flying on India. You couldn't get out, you're in, and it's like, and in our area, there were hundreds of people in the hospital with the Black Plague. It could be treated with antibiotics. And it said if you take antibiotics, if you took them, you were resistant for 6 weeks. So everyone was just gulping it down, okay, let's go. And the Black Plague is back. So antibiotics had a handle on it, just as an example. So we're living in an experimental world. That's my point. And therefore I think that the Western world is a world that needs to look at traditional cultures. Because traditional cultures, first of all, they are tested over time. They're tested over time, and they're more traditional, and may have oftentimes positive alternatives that would be less harmful. For example, if you break your leg, I'm telling all kinds of nice things, bacteria, breaking your leg. Anybody walking out of this lecture must be feeling really great. Yeah. If you break your leg, nowadays, they take you to a hospital and they zap you, right? The people who do it, they are wearing lead aprons, they are behind a LED screen, and they have a control panel at there, and they have a badge which measures possible radiation that, in spite of the LED screen and the LED apron, may still penetrate. And my sister did this job, that's how I know, and she would get off all the time. Whenever she had an overdose of radiation, then she'd get like 3 weeks off, and it happened regularly. Right? I said, oh, she liked it. Said, okay, I'm 3 weeks off. I go, yeah, good for you, but not for me. So, in the Vedic literature, they have like some sort of herbal bandage which you wrap around your leg, and then if there's a fracture, it shows a red line exactly where the fracture is. Then they could set the bone. Looks to me like pretty good. Hey, without zapping, they could pretty much do the same thing. So oftentimes you'll find in traditional cultures, you find interesting solutions because mankind hasn't changed. Yeah? People still had 2 legs and 2 arms, 1 nose and 2 eyes and so on. Yeah? Same kind of people, same minds, same dynamics. Nothing has changed in that respect. Therefore, I think this Vedic culture is very interesting. To me, it became so interesting that I said, yes, I go for it. Right? To you, it may not have that same impact, and that's all right, but we should not underrate it either. See, Vedic culture has been underrated for a long time, because after all, the first people that came, or first people in modernity that came to India, were from England, since it was their colony, and so early Indologists mostly had a strong Christian agenda and a very biased opinion about that culture, and they systematically tried to diminish it, put it down, present it as primitive, and so on. So, and up to the day of today, a lot of that, of those views are still proliferating, even in modern literature. And therefore our view of Indian tradition is still very incomplete. For example, why do we begin philosophy with the Greeks? Why? Was there nothing before the Greeks? India, yeah, we cannot call it. I heard a professor, well, we cannot call it really a system of philosophy because it is all like spread out, like in different fragments and different texts. Yeah, okay, they may have had a different format than we have today, but you could have. It can be filtered out. There are even those who did it. There's a famous scholar named Das Gupta who exactly did that, who wrote the Indian philosophy in a Western format. Yeah, so it's been done already. Anyway, so I think it shows how the Western world still has a somewhat biased approach, unfortunately. Which therefore I'm happy to have the opportunity to be with you today and present a little bit a Vedic angle on modern issues, because I think that stress is not just a human issue, it's also a social issue, and I think that our society today is a stress society. We have a stress lifestyle. Like I stress with 100 k's an hour, I'm okay. With 120 k's an hour, okay. Above 140, the stress increases. Above 160, the stress is high. Above 200, I'm dead scared. I'm like, I want to get out of that car. It's like, oh God. I start praying and tell you that, I get religious. I mean, I pray, I promise God, if I get out of this one alive, I'll be good, People that go in the curve with 180 and come out with 210, have you ever been in a car like that? There is a technique of driving, I don't know how to do it myself, but you go in the curve and you speed up in the curve. I don't like it. I really don't like it. Things like that, So what are we doing? So part of our of looking at our modern culture in relation to tradition culture is the traditional culture is asking the question, what are you doing? What are you doing? And I think that's a very healthy question, and we need that. We need to actually question our culture desperately, because we're making a mess out of things. Yeah, I'm sorry to say, mate, I don't want to get on anybody's case, but, I mean, pollution is an example of which mode? Goodness, passion, or ignorance? Which one? Well, combination of passion and ignorance. To live in your own dirt. Yeah? And would you do that? If you do that to your house, right? You have a house, and you just keep on throwing stuff out of the windows into the garden, you know, until it piles up, until one day you can't look out of the windows anymore. I mean, that's what we're doing to the planet. Right? And then you got the American model, which is enjoy, 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 we are America, all on credit cards. Right? To a point, you know, where the whole world is seeing the dollar, the US dollar now shaking. You know, you go like, but what's wrong with you people? You know, any simple, any simple mother, right, knows that you can't, who's not educated or nothing, she knows you can't spend what you don't have, right? That's pretty obvious, right? God, and if you start doing that, then, you shoot yourself in the foot. So we have a strange world, and in modernity, I don't think I'm overly aggressive from the representing the Vedic point of view to say that there are some serious imbalances in our modern society, and that therefore it's really relevant to look at traditional models and question our values. And that, on a bigger scale, can relieve the anxiety in the world. Now, any questions? Otherwise, I waffle on. I'm good at it. I can waffle. I can fill up the time and waffle away. No problem. I can waffle all day. Yes.
I just want to know the Vedic view on reality. So what is reality from Vedic life? From Western point of view, there are either real, or critical real, or multiple realism there. From
I think, in many ways we can see that Vedic culture and Western culture are describing the same elements in reality. Modern culture has broken down nature in certain chemical elements and so on. Vedic culture also does that. The elements are different, but the concept is similar. Vedic culture recognizes atoms, modern culture recognizes atoms. So in that way, things are not so fundamentally different. I guess the orientation of Vedic culture is much more spiritual. For example, there is a concept in one scripture about electricity, and it describes how they were using electricity for defense. And they had big electric fencing. Not only that, they had walls of gas, which is very advanced. We haven't managed that yet. They had walls of gas and things like this for defense mechanisms. Anyway, back about the electricity. Then it said, but electricity in itself, it was described in that scripture, is an element which will bring great havoc and destruction upon society. Therefore, it should not be used. It's like, what a message, right? To modern times. No electricity. I admit, I'm using it too, everywhere. A watch has a battery, and what would we do without electricity? But it is just interesting that they knew about electricity and chose not to use it, that they saw dangerous consequences of it. So I don't think we should look at the differences in terms of analyzing matter, because there are differences, but more corresponding in general terms. We more or less agree. on what we see. Sometimes, yeah. For example, you know, modern science comes up with a heliocentric model of the universe, or centered around the sun. They came up with a geocentric model of the universe. It's just a different way to calculate it, but basically the same. So that's not the issue. But the issue was that there was a totally different approach to life. They saw life as well, the first priority in life as spiritual. The point was, you know, in the West, in Western religious traditions and so on, you also find plenty of reference to a soul, right? And, you know, you can look up soul in the dictionary, and if you see soul, then all the definitions of the dictionary, they correspond with a text like the Bhagavad Gita, right? Same. Soul is eternal, soul is indestructible, soul is infinitesimally small, you know, all kinds of things like that. You just find them in a dictionary. So soul is nothing new to the Western world, old hat. You know. But there is one interesting thing that is different. In the Western concept, it is they are discussing about having a soul, and in the Eastern context they are discussing about being soul. And they say if the body is temporary and the soul is eternal, right? Then what are you, soul or body? For now, a combination of the two, but maybe after 80 years, when the body is no longer there, then still soul, and no more body. Therefore, the Eastern context is we are soul and have body. Western concept was we have soul, and then that implies we are body. So this Vedic concept is a very much a concept of we're not the body. We are that eternal spiritual being, and there's a lot of focus in thought on that. I'd say that has the priority in life. That comes first. First priority, do something for the soul. Then additional priority is take care of the physical needs. And I'd say that is the main distinction between East and West. Otherwise we find many similarities, and it's okay, different applications and so on. But for example, we have nuclear energy. They also had nuclear energy. Yeah. They had ways of unleashing nuclear energy different than we do now, through mantra actually, through sound. Not anyone could do it, but you know, there was a science, and advanced practitioners could unleash nuclear energy. And we find we find remnants like the Gobi Desert, for example, shows signs of some radioactive fallout, a blast. There are remnants of an ancient blast there found in the Gobi Desert. You can check it on the web. So, like that, Vedic culture claims, yes, nuclear energy was known and employed. But the value, the concept of body and soul, that connection. Whereas the West more body, mind, soul, and the East more soul, mind, body. Yeah, just starting from the other side. That's the big difference. Yeah, thank you also. I hope you'll find these kind of talks interesting and stimulating. It's the tip of an iceberg, obviously, because we're dealing with a culture. And when you deal with a culture, you cannot cover a culture in a lecture, not even in a series of lectures, not in a book. The Vedic, what is known as the Vedas, or Vedic literature is a library, it's a huge library. And Vedic literature today, what is available is a library. And they estimate that approximately only 6% of the original is available today. So many manuscripts are lost and this and that. So they estimate that about 6% is available. And that is a library. So therefore, Vedic tradition is also rich. India is not a country. India is like a continent, like Europe. Yeah? Like Europe, consisting of many, many countries. India consisted of many kingdoms. In Europe, all these countries have a common Christian culture. In India, there was a common Hindu culture, Hinduistic culture. But each kingdom has its own practices, its own tradition, its own languages, and these languages are very different sometimes. I mean, between Hindi and Tamil, it's a universe, you know, Tamil and Hindi, ha ha ha, he he he, ha, he, ha. It sounds totally different, and the customs are different. People, the Tamils and the North Indians look at each other like, you know, as if they are from a different planet. They don't even talk to each other. It's strange, you know. So like that, it is actually India, a conglomeration of many different kingdoms that all have their own language and their own tradition within the Vedic culture, and therefore it's quite something. Therefore, in India there's a lot to study. I've spent now so many years, and I can't really say that I have truly penetrated in Vedic culture as a whole. I'm a bit more familiar with it now than I used to be. That's all I can say. And the more familiar I get, the more I realize how much the West can be benefited from the East. And with that, I thank you and hope you appreciated the talk and hope to meet you again.